Hey there. In Layla Saad's book, Me and White Supremacy, she outlines 12 examples of white apathy in action. These are excuses white allies use to not get involved in anti-racist work. One of these is perfectionism. Saad writes that white allies use perfectionism to avoid doing the work and fear using their voices or showing up for anti-racist work until they know everything perfectly and can avoid being called out for making mistakes. These videos on this YouTube channel are my attempt to overcome that. I know as a white woman in America, I never will know enough. I know that there is no perfect understanding of race and equity, but I've decided not to let that keep me from having this conversation. So I will make mistakes, I will learn along the way, but my hope is to use these videos to share what I have learned, things I'm thinking about, and to help myself and others grow along the way. Thanks for watching. Hi, and thanks for tuning in to what might be the first of several videos that I was thinking of making. I've had this idea kind of rolling around in my head for a while because I've spent the summer doing a lot of reading and listening and watching about things having to do with equity and also anti-racism. And it seems like almost every text I interact with, there's at least one kind of like big takeaway that really sticks with me. And so I thought that it would be kind of cool to have a space where I could share those one or two key ideas and just talk a little bit about them, and hopefully a short video in hopes that maybe other people will learn something and maybe be inspired to do a little bit more research or reading on their own. So the first one I want to talk about today is implicit bias, because I see a lot of memes and things like that popping up on Facebook about it. And there's some understanding of it already floating around, but I do think it's something that we need to be a lot more willing to acknowledge if we're going to make any changes in terms of prejudice and racism in our society. So I want to talk a little bit about two big takeaways from some reading I did recently about racism and implicit bias. Again, I think there are so many things that are not necessarily revolutionary. It's just that we come across this snippet that just really speaks to us and kind of explains so many things in just one or two sentences. And for me, these were two big ideas. One comes from a website, from an Ohio State website, which I'll actually cover later on here in the presentation, that says the implicit associations we hold do not necessarily align with our declared beliefs or even reflect stances we would explicitly endorse. And the second one says racism and prejudice exists on a spectrum, not on an on and off switch. So I'm hoping to make more sense of those as we go. And the first way I'm going to do that is by just giving like a very quick introduction to implicit bias, how it works, how it affects us. Again, this could be its own topic for an hour-long discussion, so this is just a really quick overview. First of all, we all know that we live in this society surrounded by all of these influences. So anything you see here on the screen, and there are more beyond this, and several of these have kind of subcategories, but there are all of these different things that act on us in addition to our own biology and genetics as well, that kind of shape the way we see the world. So our experiences in these categories that you see on the screen we are the result of these experiences in these categories. You know from living that your experiences can change. And so as we go through life and these different factors kind of pop in and out and affect us in different ways, that can, of course, change the way that we see the world as well. So implicit bias comes into play when those types of things in the world affect our attitudes or our understandings about things. So a definition of implicit bias from the Kirwan Institute, which is a branch of Ohio State University, they define implicit bias as the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions, and our decisions, importantly, in an unconscious manner. And so basically the short version of this is that unconsciously we have attitudes, opinions, prejudices, stereotypes in our mind because of our experiences in these areas. So if you had only one interaction with a dog and it was negative, you're going to have a negative perception as a result of that experience. The implicit part, which is what's most important in this conversation, suggests that it's unconscious. So what happens is we are constantly receiving messages and symbols as we go throughout our lives. And implicit bias suggests that we have collected some attitudes that are prejudiced or stereotypical, and we may not consciously be aware of that. The thing about unconscious bias, or implicit bias, is it's unconscious. I've already mentioned that. It's malleable, meaning it can change. So as we go through different experiences, we can learn and unlearn different things. We'll come back to this because an important part of that learning and unlearning is first acknowledging that it even exists. The bottom two are incredibly important, and in my opinion, something that we should be talking a lot more about if we're going to make any changes in systemic racism and prejudice in our society. So one is that they're unintentional. These sort of collect in our brain, but not through any purpose of our own or our parenting or anything. We'll talk next about representation. This is just sort of what happens unintentionally, kind of in the back of our mind, as we go through the world and perceive different medias and technologies and people. The second one is that they're incredibly pervasive, meaning there's a lot of them, and meaning that they're important and that they play an important role in the way your brain does things and decides things. This is why representation matters, because as we continue to see the same stereotypes over and over again, or the same representations of good guys and bad guys, or criminals and police officers, or doctors versus housekeepers, those all sort of collect unintentionally and unconsciously in our subconscious. And so when push comes to shove and we're acting kind of more from our instinctual standpoint, that is when these biases take place. So we develop biases, as I've said, over the course of our lives because we are constantly exposed to symbols. And we see these symbols directly, which, in the case of think of like a campaign, well, any commercial really, or advertisement where it is explicitly messaging to you, but also indirectly. So skin color of characters in the shows that we're watching, the professions that are being played by people of different colors or people of different sexes or gender orientations. When we see certain types of people, for example, what role are they in? And do we keep seeing that? This is why the media that we consume is so crucial in terms of our development. This is why advocates want equal representation of people of color in TV and media. This is why it's important that children see, males, females, and non-binary individuals in a variety of roles and a variety of characters in the books and the media that they watch, because it's all sort of leaving these little tidbits of bias in our brain, sort of unknowing on our part. So the other thing we know is that our biases tend to favor our own in-groups. So we tend to favor people who look like us, sound like us, and make sense to us. And some of that is just, your brain surviving. Your brain knows from olden times of survival that things that look or sound or seem different could be dangerous, and thus we should raise the red flags. And so our job as individuals who would like to overcome our biases is to be aware that that's going to be our natural instinct to difference, is to maybe pull away or to put up a wall or to, say, no, this is wrong, to judge, to criticize. And so we have to be aware of that first in order to overcome it. So we know that we feel comfortable in things that look, sound, and represent like us, but we know that that doesn't mean that there's any morality behind that, but that's just our brain kind of operating from survival instincts. So let's think back to representation and think of why this might matter. And there are statistics that prove all of these. I summarized just for the sake of simplicity. So politicians in this country are predominantly white males. When you think of a politician, you are most likely, the first picture that pops up is probably going to be a white male. Now, if I say to you, oh, does that mean a woman of color cannot be a politician? You'll say, oh, no, of course not. And you might even be able to come up with an example. But that first instinct, that first image of predominantly white male when you think politician is what an implicit bias looks like. It's in those moments where we don't take the time to stop and think. Teachers are predominantly white females. Police officers are predominantly white males. Judges are predominantly white males. Doctors are predominantly white males. If you are a child of color, and specifically a female of color, this is the representation that you see in your world. This is your vision of these 5 professions, for example. The other side of this, as a white female myself, is to represent or is to understand why this matters. Politicians, police officers, well, even teachers, like within a classroom setting, judges, doctors, these are all professions who exist in a position of power. And if we don't acknowledge our biases, which we've accumulated unconsciously, unintentionally, then we aren't necessarily prepared to adequately serve people beneath us, our constituents, as it were, who are not like us. That is a problem. When we are not able to recognize that I see things, I'm a teacher, I'm a white female teacher, I'm exactly the stereotype. I naturally am going to see the world and my content and my curriculum and my lesson plans through the lens of what it means to be a white female teacher. But I'm going to have students in my classroom who are not white females. And so being able to first acknowledge that there is a difference, and then to say, okay, I need to now, acknowledge where are my biases so that I can work to overcome them. And there are tons of examples to prove this. So in 2012, for example, there was a case study about pediatricians, and they found that pediatricians were more likely to prescribe painkillers to other white patients as opposed to Black patients. Now, if you pulled these pediatricians aside and you said, do you think that your Black patients are more likely to make up their pain, or do you think they don't deserve equal treatment? These pediatricians would say, absolutely not. My job is to take care of everyone. And yet the research shows that they're not treating all of their patients equally. And that's because of an implicit bias. So are we unconsciously letting some biases about a certain community affect the way we do our job? Another one found that judges were harsher when sentencing individuals with Afrocentric features. So characteristics, darker skin, wide nose, full lips, for example, were much more likely to receive negative judgments than those who had lighter skin, etc. Again, I would hope, few judges who would explicitly say, oh yeah, I do that on purpose. But this is when we look at these big case studies where we see bias, because you look at, one judge in one case and it could just be what it is. But when we see these numbers being duplicated over and over again, that's when we start to see a systemic problem. Here's another one in the case of teachers. This group of researchers watched elementary teachers teach, and they noticed that they were more likely to observe Black students than white students, specifically Black boys, thus challenging their behaviors. And so we do see more discipline referrals and stricter punishments for Black boys in public education. And one level of that, there are many components to that topic, is, are we looking for those behaviors in those kids? again, pull those teachers out and say, are you watching the Black kids and waiting for them to act up? And most teachers are going to say absolutely not. But when researchers study this and the teachers are acting unconsciously, they do, in fact, keep an eye on those kids more often. And again, these studies can be replicated in large scale. So this isn't just this one teacher, or, well, that kid just happens to be a behavior problem and happens to be Black. We're seeing this reproduced in a large scale. So Harvard has also been studying this for 20 years. I think the original version of this Project Implicit Bias test came out shortly after 2000, and originally it was just a race question, and over time they have built it to include more. You can go on and take this for free. You could just type in, I'll put the link below, but you can just type in Harvard Project Implicit or Implicit Bias test. You can pick your bias on here that you want to study. You go through, and basically what it does is it rapid shows you images, and you put good, bad, good, bad, good, bad. And how it works is it doesn't give you time to process. You're responding from an instinctual area of your brain, and this is where we see that that bias overwhelmingly comes out. Your results most likely will favor people who look and sound like you or identify like you. So I could take this, for example, the race one down there at the bottom, and it might come back that I have like a 68% bias for white faces because it shows you faces of people. And so I use this in my class a lot, in my sociology class, and the kids always say, oh, I'm 68% racist. Oh, I'm 72% racist. That's not what it's saying. And that sort of comes to the second big idea that I talked about, which is that there is not just racist or not racist. There is a spectrum. We are all on it. We are all racist. Every single human has a prejudice somewhere on the spectrum. Our job as individuals who want to overcome this is to acknowledge that, own that, and work to be aware of that. So it isn't an issue of, are you racist or not? It's an issue of, how racist are you? And are you constantly doing the work to overcome it? If somebody walks past you on the street and you have a quick thought that you probably would never say out loud, it is your job to have the dialogue with yourself where you stop and say, where did that come from? Fear, misunderstanding, stereotypes. Why, how do I know that that's not true? It is our job as people who are anti-racist to continue to have these inner conversations with ourselves all the time. It's because it's an all the time, nonstop job because of the messaging we're sent from society. So that was kind of my one of two big ideas, was this idea that racism is a spectrum. So you frequently see people in Facebook battles like accusing someone of being racist, and then the person's like, I'm not racist, and this is why, as though it's just a yes or no. When that really shuts down a lot of conversation. Nobody wants to say they're racist, of course. And so the only other thing to be is not racist. But we need to start thinking about it not as a thing you are or not, just sort of where you're at in your area of growth. And then to kind of come back to this big idea that this is really the one that prompted me to do this. And this is the idea that our negative or implicit biases do not necessarily align with our declared beliefs. This is why good people, good police officers who value justice and who value equality shoot Black men at a disproportionate amount. It is the implicit bias that takes over in those split-second life or death situations. And as long as our police officers don't have this conversation, don't deal with the fact that they maybe see a certain representation of a certain type of person day after day, if they're not constantly doing the work to overcome the fact that that is not all people, then those implicit biases will take over all the time. And statistically, most police officers are white men, and therefore the bias is going to statistically target more likely people who do not look like them. A great example that's maybe less thorny is school principal, right? So your job is discipline. So really you see, for the most part, all day long, kids who are in trouble. Kids who get sent to the principal's office, maybe parents call and complain. You deal with a lot of the confrontational stuff. And so it is natural, if you don't do something to change your perception, you could be a principal who sits in that office all day and really feels like these all kids are bad, or your school has a problem. And maybe you see more male students, or maybe you see more Black male students. And so you start to, over time, associate implicitly, unconsciously, this connection. If you don't get out of that office and visit some classrooms and go to awards assemblies and go to sporting events and make an effort to see the other side of teenager, you would naturally kind of develop this association. And so that's kind of what's happening in a lot of different professions in our country, is people are defensive because they think prejudice and racism is an on-off. So if I say, let's talk about police officers and why they shoot Black people, as a police officer, you're going to be very defensive to that statement because we feel like you're either racist or not. So that's the first element, is it's not that you are, you aren't, we're all there. We're just all working somewhere on that spectrum. The second part is acknowledging that who you are and what you believe is valuable, but that there are also these unconscious elements that are the result of society that spring to life when you're in those moments where you have to act on instinct. And those are the things that we have to constantly work to address in ourselves. So like most things that I say, I always say I'm going to make this quick, and I never do. And that was not very quick, but it is what it is. So hopefully you watched. Leave me a comment if you want. I'll put some interesting links down below if you want to learn more. Thank you so much.